Good evening, and thank you all for attending the University of Richmond's 9th Last Lecture Series event hosted by the Omicron Delta Kappa's Epsilon Circle. The concept of a last lecture comes from Carnegie Mellon University's late professor Randy Pausch, who delivered his last lecture titled Really Achieving Your Childhood Dreams on September 18, 2007. In memory of Dr. Pausch, universities all over the country host last lecture series events where they ask professors to deliver lectures based on the following criteria. If you were to deliver a lecture that would be your last, what would you say? I would also like to thank ODK and Steve Bezese and Julia Kelly in the Office of Student Development for making it possible for this event to take place this year. All across the world, we have come face to face with a new reality, threats to our survivability unprecedented in our lifetimes. Frightening times, not only because the virus has caused catastrophic illness and death, but because we're undergoing, out of necessity, drastic changes to our daily habits, livelihoods, and the ways in which we interact with others. My purpose tonight is to assert this truth, that COVID-19 is, for the human race, an inflection point of enormous consequence. We have arrived at a place where the choices we make will determine our shared destiny. This is not to minimize or lessen mankind's extraordinary achievements, progress in many areas of endeavor, and the rapid advances we've made, for example, in the sciences, technology, and communication. In fact, it is these very innovations that have allowed us to remain, albeit at a distance, in contact with each other as we adjust to the ever-shifting landscape of this global crisis. But our progress has not been without negative repercussions. The coronavirus, as I will shortly point out, has brought into the open harm, inequities, and injustices that are of our own doing. Yet I will also put forth that in meeting these challenges, we've been given the chance and opportunity to expand the awareness and realization of just how strong our collective good can be and must be to create sustainable healing and positive change in the world. So what are we facing? What are the inconvenient truths the virus has exposed that are forcing us to re-examine our place in the world? Animal exploitation. First, the coronavirus is a clear warning, a direct sign that humans must move away from the exploitation of animals. The conditions leading to the suspected outbreak of COVID-19 from Wuhan, China are widespread. Animal wet markets are all around the world. There are 80 such markets in New York City alone. Dr. Anthony Fauci says, quote, "It boggles my mind how when we have so many diseases that emanate out of that unusual human to animal interface that we don't just shut it down," unquote. But animal wet markets, this is only the tip of the iceberg. Industrial factory farms spreading around the world and accounting for more than 98% of animals killed for food in the US are a global health threat. Dr. Michael Greger, infectious disease specialist, has been sounding the alarm on pandemics for over a decade. He likens each animal to a test tube capable of brewing up the next new virus. Quote, "When we overcrowd animals by the thousands in cramped football field-sized sheds to lie beak to beak or snout to snout, and there's stress crippling their immune systems, and there's ammonia from the decomposing waste burning their lungs, and there's a lack of fresh air and sunlight, put all these factors together, and you have a perfect storm environment for the emergence and spread of disease," unquote. At least 75% of emerging infectious diseases can be traced to animals, and the escalating rise of antibiotic-resistant bacteria in factory farms is already a global menace. If we remain complacent and fail to see COVID-19 as a wake-up call to rapidly move away from industrialized animal agriculture, it will only be a matter of time before more potentially deadlier pathogens arise. The natural world. This pandemic has brought to light how we've lost our sense of balance with the natural world, for the growing risk of zoonotic diseases is directly tied to widespread environmental damage that brings humans into increased contact with wildlife. As David Quammen, author of Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Pandemic, writes, quote, "We invade tropical forests and other wild landscapes which harbor so many species of animals and plants, and within those creatures, so many unknown viruses. We disrupt ecosystems, and we shake viruses loose from their natural hosts. When that happens, they need a new host. Often, we are it," unquote. Environmental damage is occurring on a vast scale through fossil fuel extraction, mining, drilling, logging, construction, urbanization, and most destructive of all, the livestock industry, a leading cause of global warming, deforestation, soil erosion and degradation, water depletion, desertification, and air and water pollution. The common saying that all things connect has never been more true. Man has pursued unrestrained industrial expansion at the expense of the natural resources that support all life on this planet. Large-scale habitat destruction not only increases the risk of infectious disease spread, the staggering loss of biodiversity impacts the survivability of all living things. We have ushered in the sixth mass extinction, with up to 1 million animal and plant species facing extinction more than at any other time in our history. As Inger Anderson, Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program, has stated, quote, "Nature is sending us a message with the coronavirus pandemic. Failing to take care of the planet means not taking care of ourselves," unquote. Climate change. In the early months of the pandemic, dramatic reductions in greenhouse gas emissions took place as the world came to a standstill, only to rebound over the summer as countries relaxed their restrictions. China, for example, the world's greatest emitter, returned to pre-COVID levels. Yet despite the mixed degrees of success around the world in dealing with the virus, there are lessons to be learned as we face what is of even greater damage: climate change. Why are we not facing it with the same degree of urgency? This is a meme. Climate change needs to hire coronavirus's publicist. Part of the challenge has to do with how humans perceive threats. The virus is a distinct entity, even if invisible to us, affecting how we live every single day, with damages assessed in the concrete numbers of those infected and lives lost. The issue of climate change, however, just doesn't carry the same sense of immediacy. Its impacts on the environment and emerging diseases seem less tangible, like a long-term and slow-moving threat, even in the face of catastrophic events like the wildfires in the West. It's almost as if we are in a collective sense of denial, reluctant to take serious, swift action, as if to say, things really can't be that bad, but certainly they are. Climate change is here, as is the coronavirus. And they're not separate and unrelated. Many of the drivers of climate change are the very same things that have brought unsurpassed damage and disruptions to the natural world, dangerously increasing the likelihood of harmful viruses jumping from wildlife to humans. Our human influence has reached its point of greatest damage upon the planet. The connections between COVID-19 and climate change cannot be overstated. Their devastation on a global scale has brought us to a point of reckoning. Dire warnings that many of the ways in which we currently live are unsustainable. As Bill Gates writes, quote, "If you want to understand the kind of damage that climate change will inflict, look at COVID-19 and spread the pain out over a much longer period of time. The loss of life and economic misery caused by this pandemic are on par with what will happen regularly if we do not eliminate the world's carbon emissions," unquote. The coronavirus has forced us to seriously and radically envision new directions for our lives. The best path forward will be one that integrates pandemic prevention into a comprehensive climate strategy, nothing less than a broad-scale intervention for the health of the planet. Social and economic inequities. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed long-standing inequities and injustices systemic in modern society. Those population segments that are disadvantaged economically and socially are at greatest risk not only for contracting the virus, but suffering a disproportionate amount of negative outcomes. The root causes? A society that has grown to prioritize material gain and a profit-driven economy, concentrating wealth in the hands of a relative few, and the absence of meaningful solutions to directly address underlying racial and ethnic discrimination that tear at the fabric of our society. These have led to drastic disparities in income and social support systems that have only widened year after year. The virus exacerbates these inequalities. Racial minorities in the US, African Americans, Hispanics, Latinos, and Native Americans are more likely to have low-paying jobs. Lacking access to medical care and health insurance, families have been forced into extreme poverty in trying to cover health costs. These populations are more prone to pre-existing health conditions that worsen the outcomes of COVID-19 and lead to higher rates of hospitalization and death. A CDC study points out that African Americans make up 33% of people hospitalized for the virus, even though they account for only 13% of the US population. Their jobs are likely to be essential frontline service jobs, from grocery and restaurant workers to custodians, clerks, administrative assistants, healthcare aides, housekeepers, and transit drivers. These jobs, many of them held by women, place workers in close proximity to others, increasing the risk for infection. And some of these occupations are among the most dangerous, where social distancing is virtually impossible with little protection given to the workers. In April, Annie Grant, a Tyson Foods poultry plant worker in Georgia, was forced to return to work despite being ill and died after a week on a ventilator. Andrea, a hospital housekeeper, says the following, quote, "We had one patient that we thought had the virus. We asked the charge nurse to send us to get fit tested for the N95 mask that everyone was wearing. Her response was, 'No, these are for special people.' And we were just like, 'We are here to clean the room and make sure no one else gets the virus, and you are telling us that these are for special people?' I've been on my unit for 7 years. We are on the same unit every day with the same people. I don't even think my charge nurse knows my name. They just see us as housekeeping. That is what they call us. It shouldn't take such a trying time for us to get recognized, considering we are the heart of the hospital, unquote. Women who shelter at home are carrying increased household burdens, including childcare, as daycare facilities struggle to stay in business, and sharp increases in domestic violence have been reported. Given the nature of jobs held by vulnerable populations in our society, the option to take time off or work remotely is often impossible, and public transportation may be the only way to get to work. Many live in areas with poor utility access and higher exposure to air pollution, a clear risk factor for serious illness or death from COVID-19. These locations are often food deserts with limited access to healthy, affordable food. And with virtually no employment security, many have lost their jobs. US unemployment soared from 3.8% in February to 13% in May. Globally, the reach of the coronavirus pandemic is unparalleled, amplifying already existing problems and inequities. From the mounting number of deaths and job losses to rising poverty, homelessness, and food insecurity, the devastation is widespread, with the majority of infections taking place in developing countries where the most basic of healthcare needs have been lost or severely disrupted. The United Nations warns that without urgent action, the number of people facing acute hunger could double to 250 million by the end of the year. Dr. Arif Hussein, chief economist at the UN World Food Programme, says, quote, "It is a hammer blow for millions more who can only eat if they earn a wage. Lockdowns and global economic recession have already decimated their nest eggs. It only takes one more shock like COVID-19 to push them over the edge," unquote. And in the words of United Nations Development Program Administrator Dr. Achim Steiner, quote, "This pandemic is a health crisis, but not just a health crisis. For vast swaths of the globe, the pandemic will leave deep, deep scars. Without support from the international community, we risk a massive reversal of gains made over the last 2 decades and an entire generation lost, if not in lives, then in rights, opportunities, and dignity," unquote. In many ways, it is not surprising that the pandemic has coincided with protests around the world for Black Lives Matter. Any recovery as we come out of this crisis must not only mitigate the physical impacts of the virus, it needs to be a fundamental structural transformation that promotes social justice across all segments of the population. This will not be without complex challenges as we call into question established economic, social, and political institutions that are only as good as their ability to provide equal opportunity, well-being, and fundamental rights. This is a turning point for society as a whole to redefine and create a future that is sustainable, healthy, and equitable for all. Turning to health. We know that individuals with underlying health conditions such as heart disease, hypertension, diabetes, lung disease, cancer, and obesity are at increased risk of severe illness from COVID-19. These chronic diseases and conditions are among the leading causes of deaths worldwide, both in developing countries and industrialized nations. We've come to label them as so-called Western diseases or diseases of affluence. In our country, it's the standard American diet, or SAD. It should come as no surprise then that among lifestyle choices, diet is the key factor here, and that by lessening the potential negative impacts of the virus, we can improve overall health as well. Overwhelming scientific evidence points to consumption of animals and animal products as a leading factor in chronic disease. Yes, early man adopted meat eating because of food availability and sheer survival needs. And animal consumption continues today despite our clearly herbivorous physiology. But for most of the world's population, it is not a necessity to eat animals in order to survive. Furthermore, the American Medical Association, the largest physicians organization in the US, now in fact recommends our dietary guidelines to state that meat and dairy products should be optional. And a 2015 landmark report by the World Health Organization classifies processed meat as carcinogenic and red meat, that's consumption of cows, pigs, goats, and sheep, as a probable carcinogen. It's not only the pandemic risk associated with using animals as a food source, meat carries the highest contamination risk for foodborne illness, Salmonella, E. coli, and Campylobacter. And we must place conscious awareness on the fact that what we eat affects our health and the health of the planet. Livestock production currently accounts for at least 51% of anthropogenic greenhouse gases. That's 4 times the amount of emissions from all modes of transportation combined worldwide. In one of the most comprehensive studies showing the connections between food consumption and the environment, a research team headed by Dr. Marco Springman at the University of Oxford, 2018, concluded that reductions in meat consumption of 75 to 90% in Western countries will be necessary to avoid the ravaging impacts of climate change. Furthermore, it's startling to realize just how massively inefficient our current food production systems are. Meat and dairy industries are enormously water intensive, accounting for at least 1/3 of global water usage. Almost 80% of the Earth's usable agricultural land is dedicated to livestock, yet the resulting yield is less than 20% of all calories produced worldwide. And the animal agriculture industry is directly tied to world hunger. Nearly half of global feed crops go to animals raised for food instead of to the people who need them the most. Farmed animals consume huge amounts of crops over their short lives, yet only about 10 to 30% of the plant's energy converts into actual body mass. The rest of the energy is lost as a result of the animal's bodily functions, including waste. A decisive shift towards plant-based foods could save 70 to 80% of the land, water, and energy resources currently directed to animal agriculture, substantially lessen pandemic risks, and make it possible to sustainably feed a global population expected to reach close to 10 billion by 2050. Professor and scientist Peter Smith at the University of Aberdeen says, quote, "We know food choices are very personal and that behavior change can be difficult to encourage. But the evidence is now unequivocal. We need to change our diets if we are to have a sustainable future. The fact that it will also make us healthier makes it a no-brainer," unquote. The awareness is rapidly growing that plant foods are the key to maintaining optimum health and preventing, even reversing disease. One of the most proactive, powerful things we can do to maintain our health during these difficult times is to increase our intake of plant-based foods. We know that countries with the greatest intake of plant foods have the lowest incidences of disease. What are the benefits? Fruits, vegetables, whole grains, nuts and seeds offer a wide range of nutrients, all important fiber, antioxidants that protect against cell damage, and thousands of phytochemicals that support good health and boost our immune systems. We're starting to see a real shift towards a new model of healthcare with the emphasis on preventing disease through nutrition. The increased interest in healthier plant-based food options, it's not just a trend, it's moved into the mainstream and taken on even more importance with a pandemic that has put our focus so squarely on health. There are undoubtedly other factors as well, whether from changing eating habits due to restaurant closures, food shortages, or perhaps sheltering at home has spurred a greater interest in nutrition and openness to exploring new food options. Regardless, even pre-COVID, we were witnessing a real explosion in the market of plant-based foods and meat and dairy alternatives, which is sure to continue. One only needs to take a look at the milk section in any grocery store. Consumers are driving this changing food landscape, and even the largest meat companies in the world, Tyson, Purdue, Smithfield, and others, have seen the writing on the wall and are coming out with their own plant-based options to meet growing buyer demands. Certainly, COVID-19 is shining a light on our personal health, but it's also exposing the stark deficiencies and unsustainable practices of our current food systems. So among the positives to come out of this crisis, one will be a new future of food, driven by our sense of innovation and purpose to meet the nutritional needs of a growing population, at the same time conserving the environment and our natural resources. This transformation will need to be one of broad, ambitious initiatives, some of which include establishment of worldwide policies for healthy diets, global expansion of organic farming, halting the destruction of rainforests, broad-scale regenerative agricultural practices to restore and improve soil fertility, improvements in crop management, yields, and irrigation practices, especially in poorer countries, a global redirection of agricultural subsidies and financial incentives away from animal products to a wide diversity of nutritious plant foods. New ways of growing foods, such as vertical farming, hydroponics, and aeroponics, that produce high food output with reduced energy and resources. Increased funding for the production of meat alternatives, including groundbreaking, innovative food technologies, such as cultured meat and even 3D printed meat substitutes, phasing out of factory farming, reductions in chemical fertilizer use, and the adoption of veganic farming, reducing the tremendous amount of food waste by at least half, implementing greater efficiency, resiliency, and risk planning in the global food supply chain, shifting to more localized networks, establishing collaborative partnerships between food retailers, farmers, business, health, and policy leaders, providing healthier food options in schools, hospitals, and workplaces, a much greater emphasis on nutrition education in medical training, and prioritizing local community programs that provide access to healthy foods in food deserts and rezoning to accommodate more urban farming. Our point of awakening, however, is so much more than changes in policies and implementing new initiatives, as critical as they are. The challenges we face connect to something much deeper, something which at the outset seems simple, and yet it is the one thing from which all follows: the nature of our relationships with all other beings in this world. It's about this defining question. Do we see ourselves in all others? In coming to grips as we live with a deadly virus in our midst, our awareness has grown of just how vital and meaningful our connections are. We've realized that even while technology can help us keep in communication with one another, it can never replace person-to-person contact. We value even more our families, friends, and loved ones. Perhaps some of us have taken the time to slow down our lives a bit, be more mindful, and reflect on what is most important to us. As many around us experience hardship, we're seeing that what is of greatest value are not the things we own, but what we have to give away. Most of all, the precious gift of compassion. Whether it be through helping our neighbors, shopping for the elderly, sewing face masks for health workers, or so many other acts of kindness, the rising spirit of volunteerism is a testament to the power of every individual to make a difference. In the words of Dimitri Frishin, a regional manager for United Nations Volunteers, quote, "These people stand united under one goal, to support people in this difficult time. They represent one group, one nation, one community. They are volunteers. They come of their own will, women and men, representing all nationalities and ages. These volunteers are the first responders to the crisis, inspired, passionate, and committed," unquote. Society should never again take for granted those essential workers who are putting their lives and the lives of their families at risk each and every day, making it possible for our daily routines to continue as close to normal as possible. And the wave of peaceful protests around the world, though not tied directly to COVID-19, are powerful expressions of the commonalities we share and the desire to live free from injustice and oppression. With music, on a lighter note, pardon the pun, we've seen how its power can connect us. And our pets are happy to have more time with us at home. Our companion animals are a real source of comfort and healing, for we have a strong sense of kinship to them and they to us. Through them, we experience shared moments of love and compassionate oneness. They are family to us. We look into their eyes and treasure how our life energy connects with theirs. Why do I bring up these animals? Because there is another side to this reality, and it's one that has vast ramifications for how we come out of this pandemic and transform our world to one of greater harmony and equality. That reality is the astounding cruelty against those animals who are killed, mostly for food, but also through the research, entertainment, and clothing industries. It's a truth that's hidden in plain sight, perhaps the greatest cognitive dissonance of our time. We know on some level that violence and death are inflicted on animals who are just as individual, sentient, and feeling as our own pets. Yet at the same time, most of society avoids facing and acknowledging this. I'll make clear that this is not about laying blame or being judgmental. Over the 10,000 years of using animals, the few species bred and consumed as food came to be perceived as objects, things, units of production, commodities. It's no wonder that in this time of COVID, our mass indifference to these innocent and vulnerable beings has been magnified. The millions of animals killed due to supply chain disruptions, they're given virtually no thought. Society is so numbed to this vast industry of killing that we even refuse to call it what it is, instead labeling it euthanasia, culling, or depopulation. But such large-scale annihilation, the most destructive act on the planet, 70 billion land animals and trillions of sea animals killed every year, cannot continue without consequence. I've spoken about the growing risk of pandemics, the global danger of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, rising significant impacts on health, catastrophic environmental devastation, staggering species loss, and world hunger. But the significance goes beyond this to our sense of identity. Through this systematized cycle of violence, we've also become separated from a part of our own humanity. The highest calling we have as living beings is to be humane, to extend our innate compassion, sympathy, or consideration for humans or animals. The farther we distance ourselves from this, our true nature, the more we harm others, and in doing so, harm ourselves. As animal and human rights advocate Patty Schenker has said, quote, "Every being is born to die, but no one should be born to be killed," unquote. The extent to which we prevent future virus outbreaks will depend on a collective act of courage where non-human animals are concerned. It's courageous to question something that most of society hasn't given thought to. It's courageous to bring our mistreatment of animals out into the open against a culture where it is so pervasively ingrained. But this courage is ultimately about acting from a single point of awareness in our hearts, that we would never wish this upon ourselves or our loved ones. It pains us to see another suffer. I believe that COVID-19 has brought us to a point of conscious reawakening about who we are and how we want to be, where we realize that our collective energy, our thoughts, feelings, and actions affect all living beings and the earth around us in profound ways. As humanity passes through this time of crisis that challenges and threatens us in so many ways, we can seize this moment as a time of transformation, a crossroads in our evolution. COVID-19 has forced us to examine our place in the world, yet it's also an opportunity to reshape how we move forward. Every point of connection we have is so much deeper, more vast, and consequential than we realize. We have a difficult task ahead of us. If one believes in fate, perhaps it was part of humankind's destiny that it would take this adversity of lethal global proportions to wake us out of our complacency and the false illusion that we could continue on our path unaffected and control and bend nature to our will. And the menace of a virus that knows no boundaries has expanded our global perspective, that we are one global family, one world consciousness bound by our shared humanity. We know now that navigating our future will depend upon our ability to aggressively pursue preventive courses of action on a global scale that dramatically raise our preparedness level and effectively integrate the economic, social, health, and environmental aspects of our lives. In heeding the lessons of COVID-19, we can't fall back to all our old habits. Instead, we must forge ahead to a new future, a new normal. We're facing an invisible enemy, but the capacities we have as humans are strong, if not stronger. Our intellect, spirit of innovation, creativity, optimism, determination, and innate compassion. To conclude, I look into the future and see the possibilities for a bold new world. We end the ravages upon our planet, instead regenerating and preserving its many gifts that allow us to live. We expand upon the rising awareness that food should be healing and not born of violence. We find strength and common purpose through our diversity, embracing our commonalities as a source of healing. A world of greater peace, health, and harmony is not beyond our grasp. It's about the simple yet powerful truth that we are all connected. Thank you.